to explore the character of the threat and the implications for the Nordic-Baltic region, I have here today excellent discussants, Mr. Carsten Friis, who is the head of Security and Defense Research Group from the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs, and Mr. Niklas Granholm, Deputy Director of Study, Swedish Defense Research Agency. I would like to kick off this discussion with one question, which is, how do you understand ambiguous threats, and what is the value of discussing this kind of concept today? Let me start with Carsten.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me. There's been, a kind of research of these concepts, ambiguous threats, or hybrid warfare, and these things, and I think they all kind of try to capture the same. As you said, processes that goes below the threshold, that we don't really know what's going on. And those who have read the Theory of War know about Sun Tzu, which is basically says that you should try to achieve your political ends without firing a shot, or with at least using as little firepower as possible. And I think this is very much the same. It's about expanding beyond the military sector into other sectors, economic, political, media, etc., to try to manipulate the opponent, the other country, for instance, to achieve your goals. So, in a way, you can say that in traditional military, you escalate vertically, whereas in this kind of threats, you can escalate horizontally by adding new dimensions. And all these sectors don't necessarily know about what's happening in the other sectors. And combined, they have an effect that might put the government in a situation that they don't want to be in. But we don't know before it's too late, maybe, because we don't really talk to each other across the sectors. That's one way of putting it.
Sure.
Niklas, what is your take on it?
Well, I think it's a very good question to start with. What do we actually mean by ambiguous threats? And I think that Carsten, your idea about adding new sectors to the concept is very good, very apt, I think. But it's also, I think, a way of defining it where an actor can use the gaps between these different sectors. I mean, we have organized ourselves in military, civilian, economic stuff, and there are clear gaps between these areas. And if you can exploit those, then you're ambiguous in the perception of our own threats. It's our perception, I think, that is central here. So a way of exploiting the gap and the delineation that we have bureaucratically made between our own systems here. So then I'd like to add one thing as well. We probably need to think also on the concept of whether we can see that there is a rational actor behind the threat, or is it a perception only that, well, suddenly the lights went out, but it could have been an accident. Or is it something that someone is doing to exploit the weakness here? Can we discern between the two factors here? I think that's will be central, but that's maybe later in discussion.
So how do you see the ambiguous threats currently or in the future in the Nordic-Baltic region? And in this answer, I would like you to also think about the most worrisome and the most dangerous kind of threat, or maybe vulnerabilities.
Yeah.
Well, start.
You alluded to something about it, put a word on it. It's synchronized. I think these attacks have to be synchronized to have an effect. And so to answer your question, what are the most risky scenarios in our countries, which are very democratic, very open, and very digitalized? I think the best way to kind of answer that is to look at where are our national vulnerabilities. It's a critical infrastructure, critical digital infrastructure, open media, open trade, all these areas where anyone really can go in and engage, hostile takeovers in the financial sector, for instance, or what similar things. And because we are so open and so digitalized, there are numerous, just a fantasy really limits where you can kind of try to prod in if you want to have an effect. But again, there had to be a combined effort. It cannot be just one by one in a random way. And we don't really talk about the military component so much, but it's usually there and looming in the background, if nothing else, right?
Sure.
If you only talk about, we don't talk about the Cold War here, which is like a tug of language and exchanges. It's a bit more heated up than this, and So there had to be a kind of violent dimension, at least, I would say, in the background. So then we can look at, I don't know, I will not go into Swedish examples. And fortunately, we haven't seen too many in Norway, but one example that has been mentioned in the debate is that when there suddenly came lots of refugees from Russia into Norway and the northern border with Russia up north. And lots of speculations was that a kind of hybrid warfare from Russia's point of view. It was a one-off incident, so I wouldn't call it synchronized, and therefore I don't think it was. And later investigation turned out it was probably more exploited than planned from Kremlin. In other words, when they realized it was happening, they didn't stop it. They let it go on a little bit to let us boil. But when it was, when they decided to stop it stopped, and since then there has been no refugees across that border crossing.
Yeah.
One example.
But that could have been ambiguous too, because the perception of what was going on was ambiguous in itself.
Absolutely.
Was it a rational actor behind it, or was it just happened, more or less?
Criminal actors.
As a criminal actors, or more of a freak accident that led to this. But I'd like to continue on to this, but because we do have a number of vulnerable systems, and I would say that the electricity grid in open societies, such as the Nordic ones, are very vulnerable here. And I think that the main challenge is now to build in resilience in these systems. I mean, there's certainly some resilience there already, but it has to be added on, I would say. And if you add on all the IT systems that we have now and rely very heavily on, are also very much dependent on the electricity. So if those break down, or there is some kind of malicious code, or they simply are badly designed so that they break down after a while, that could also be very ambiguous. And if you add to that we are all linked into a very sophisticated information system, which gives us a constant feedback loop all the time. So if anything happens, everyone knows about it over your smartphone or media or somewhere very quickly. And that also leads to that someone could use an ambiguous threat or execute an ambiguous threat in one of the sectors that we mentioned. And that could in turn lead to a way of creating uncertainty or even panic in certain sectors of society. So there is a feedback loop here. And what all this points to, you could also add, of course, the Internet of Things. I mean, your toaster is talking to your fridge. And we could see what that led to in the US very recently. And the jury is still out on what really happened there, but there's more on it. But it also means that we have very quickly got IT systems, IT-based systems that we haven't really learned to master. It's new technology, and the reaction to how to manage this technology, that's not there yet. And that's again a gap that can be exploited, another dimension here of the threat that I think we can see. Could I add one last thing on this, and that is also that the physical things that we actually need and use, and probably everything we see in this room, 9 things out of 10 have come across the sea. And we are extremely dependent on seaborne trade and the uninterrupted flow of these things, being open economies and open trade and all that. And that leads me to think that all this just-in-time model of production means that we are, on the one hand, extremely efficient economically. There are no big warehouses with stuff that you use for primary goods to make intermediary goods and so on. They are all in containers out to sea. And if there is an interruption here, and again linked into an IT-based system on where all this stuff is, where it's going to be transported and to whom, and when it's supposed to arrive. If there is a gap in this chain of deliveries, our economies would very quickly seize up and stop. So I think I can stop there. Yeah.
Can I throw in one more example? Sure. We saw, you mentioned digital attacks and cyber attacks.
Right.
And we saw in Ukraine that the power grid was shut down last Christmas with huge impact.
Yep.
So that's a cyber attack which has implications in the physical world. So it's not like going in and stealing somebody's data, but it's actually doing something that has physical implications. That's a kind of, we call it sabotage, cyber sabotage, as contrary to cyber espionage. And that's a concern, a growing concern. And that is something which is also vulnerable for us, with our electrical grids, but all other public production facilities. And in our country, gas and oil production and gas and oil exports is all controlled and managed through digital systems. So in principle, anyone can hack our oil export or gas exports to the continent and turn off our gas export.
Right.
And that's pretty, shocking. I don't know the technical details of how to do it, but they say it's doable. And those are the kind of things I don't think we have thought enough about. Just to take an example of an area that we haven't thought about the kind of national security context before. And every country has examples like that.
So if we have a deeper dive into ambiguous threats, what would be the indicators or warnings or those signs that we can use as signposts to understand that those are actually ambiguous threats, those are actually threats?
I think, sorry,
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Sure. Well, I think the important thing is to say that, well, maybe the likeliness of these types of attacks all over and coordinated is pretty low, but the consequences of an attack would be so severe that we have to take it very seriously anyway. And I think we're slipping into the discussion on the solution to these problems, that when you design new systems, whether it be physical transport or oil or gas or a supply chain for intermediary goods or anything, you have to build in this resilience from the beginning. So you'll be sure that actually, well, this is actually a technical malfunction, and this was actually something that someone was going to introduce from the outside. So I think that's in principle, I think, what needs to be done.
Karsten, you wanted to say something?
As you said earlier, our societies are very compartmentalized. We have the sectors, so we're sector divided. And it's good for the kind of chain of command responsibility that there is no blurring, but at the same time the one hand doesn't know what the other one is doing. In an authoritarian society, it's opposite. So somebody can sit on top and kind of control all these tools at the same time. And that's a huge advantage, obviously, because you can synchronize the attack. So how are we going to know if things happen in 5, 6, 7 places at the same time before it's too late that it's actually happening? The only way is to for those who are responsible for these sectors to be aware, to have a security awareness, which they don't have very often. And secondly, for them to communicate to each other. Right? We have some kind of a national situational awareness. If you don't have that, you will not know until it's too late. That's the whole beauty of it, if I may use that term.
But the crucial question, I think we said this earlier, to be able to discern an accident or a malfunction from something that is an active attack. And when you reach that threshold, and that will be also in for an aggressor to make sure that you could keep a conflict just below the boiling point. So you don't really know. There are all kinds of malfunctions here, but the systems are old and it's ambiguous. You can't really tell whether this is an attack or there's some agent behind it or not. And that will be really crucial stuff. And I think that's the cutting edge of what we need to think through.
Still, I would like to add one more comforting dimension, though. I don't think this will come out of the blue. I mean, it comes in a political context where things are already a bit heated, right? We know who did the Ukraine power grid, right? And that's not only because forensics, but political scientists like myself can add 2 and 2 together. So we will know who is behind it, and it will be a situation where you are at somewhat more alert anyway. So maybe we will then also, people who don't usually think security will be a bit more aware because of the situation the country is in.
But it's also, I mean, if you build new systems, you need to have some kind of resilience inbuilt from the beginning in new systems. But there could also be a massive infrastructure system. The power grid, the oil distribution system from Norway down to the continent is one example. And how do you retrofit a system to manage and control and make it more resilient as well? That's usually much more expensive. But it's also, maybe you could talk about the mental resilience as well, that you have people who are used to thinking in these terms and are prepared, so they can read the signs when this happens, because there has to be someone behind it. You cannot trust machines wholly with these decisions. It has to be a judgmental process behind it, and that's much more difficult.
So we are now slipping into the last but very important question:
Sure.
how exactly to deal with those
Yep.
threats.
Yep.
What would you recommend to your own governments, the governments of the whole Nordic-Baltic region? And in your recommendations, is it possible to discern between recommendations aimed at deterrence side of it and recommendations regarding defense side of it?
Right. Do you want to start? Or? Yeah.
Okay, point one, awareness. As I mentioned before, different sectors that might be under such attacks need to be aware that there's a security dimension in their world. And that takes a while, and that's about education. Secondly, you need to build some kind of system, national system of situational awareness. And to achieve that, we need to have somebody to collect from all these different sectors, to collect it in a kind of a fusion cell or whatever you want to call it, national intelligence, that basically keeps the temperature on different sectors and are not, hijacked by their own indicators, but are always open for new areas where things can happen, right? Looking for anomalies rather than looking at what they usually look at, right? Because you never know where this might happen. So that requires an national organizational structure, right? You need somebody out there in the field, so to speak, to pick up what's going on, but you need somebody to collect it and assess it, and as you said, recognize if it's an accident or malfunction or actually something that is more suspicious. Only then you can start responding. And you said deterring and responding. I don't think you used the word resilience. We cannot stop it. Rarely, because we want to have our open societies. We have our stock markets working. We have our free internet. We can do something, but we cannot. I don't think we can kind of build walls, because then we don't have our free democratic societies anymore. So it's more about being resilient and be able to at least engage it when it happens, but we cannot prevent them from trying, to put it that way.
And the resilience will also, if it's put into proper effect, it will also have the effect of saying that actually there's really no point in attacking us. You will not get what you want from this. Our societies will not crumble, they will remain open, but we won't be naive in believing the threat are there. You also alluded to an offensive capability, that if you do it to us, we'll do it to you. I don't think so. I think we will stay on trying to keep it safe in that way.
At least in the Nordic-Baltic region.
Indeed. So. I mean, what great powers can get up to, that's another matter. But for the Nordic region, I don't really see that.
No, we will be very careful.
Do you see that there are specific capabilities or institutions that would be needed for this?
I think that there are existing functions and capabilities, much as Carsten mentioned earlier. They are certainly there, but I think they need to be augmented to handle the ambiguity.
So we talked about critical infrastructure aspects. Would you like to talk also about civil society, media, information aspect of this?
Sure. Yeah, I can start if you like, but it's what we do have also is again an awareness, not only of the vulnerabilities of our own systems that we rely on, but also on the information sector. If someone is saying this, is it someone else behind it, or is it someone who's checked what the sources are? Can you evaluate what is actually, whether this is actually true information that is coming out, or is it designed to create ambiguity, and it's not A but it's not B, so the truth must be somewhere in between, etc. So I think there is a challenge here again with the information-based society, where we're sort of flooded with information and data all day. It's cognitively a very difficult challenge, and I think only education and analysis and discussion of what the problems are, and acknowledging mistakes as well. I think that would be the important thing to say.
Thank you. Carsten?
Thanks.
Yeah, no, I missed your question again.
So I was asking whether you would be willing to speak about the media and civil society aspect,
yeah,
information
sorry.
side.
Absolutely, because if the purpose is to kind of disturb the society somehow, not necessarily the state, but to change opinions or to question things, media, private sector, all these are important, vital elements of the society. And again, using cyber as an example, all cyber infrastructure is in private hands. It's not owned by governments.
Yeah, good point.
So you need private sector involved, both as victims, but also as a part of the solution. Yeah. And civil society, that's a very general term, but that's also part of it. Some countries have minorities. Some countries have people who are more vulnerable to such attacks than others. And they need to also be, engaged in this and recognize it, that they might be, under manipulation, for instance.
Yeah. And another area that can be part of ambiguous threats is sub-war, sub-conflict level military activities. What are the recommendations regarding these kinds of activities? How can we build our resilience here?
Yeah. I think that some of the systems that we had designed, because this was part of the Cold War setup as well, but that disappeared in the early 90s, most of it, because everyone said we really don't need it. At least that goes for Sweden. And I think Norway sort of scaled down those efforts as well. And we have basically a very different society from 25 years ago. I think that revisit some of the solutions we had then and take into account that we have this new social media landscape which has to be added on in the information management side of things. Easy to say, I think it's rather complicated to do. The last time when things took a turn for the worse in the late 1940s and early 50s, it took at least Sweden 10 years to build up a reasonably resilient system that lasted us and took us through the Cold War.
Thank you.
What these challenges, this more violent scenario that you were mentioning, the challenges the gray zone between police and armed forces. Let's say you have a situation that looks like some kind of a police, some violent gang or something, that heats up a little bit and heats up more and more. And at some stage, maybe you need special forces from armed forces to help the police. And at some stage, when is it a military issue, right?
Sure.
Most of us don't have really idea about this, because the police is inside and military is outside, kind of, and they have some agreements to support each other, right? But it's in these kind of scenarios, most countries don't have doctrines or smooth ideas, exact ideas about how this transition would happen.
Yeah.
And that is extremely risky, because that can be exploited, right? And it can make it difficult for us to respond in a very, very dangerous situation, where lives are at risk.
Yeah. So we are nearing the end of our conversation today. Are there any last comments that you would like to share with our viewers?
Well, I think that this whole discussion has shown that we have a number of challenges ahead of us that are the result of new technology and new societal ways of doing things, and our dependence on these very advanced IT-based systems as well. And there are a number of for an analyst, a very interesting set of challenges that we have ahead of us. So that's where I would like to end.
I agree completely, and this has just as much to do with our own societies developing as to do with Russia. Let's call it what you're talking about in this part of Europe.
Sure.
If Russia was to become our friend again tomorrow, it will still be vulnerable to much of the same attacks. So this is something we have to address, irrespective of who is in Kremlin.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Nicholas and Karsten, for the discussion, and let me thank you, our internet viewers, for tuning in for the first coffee break session of the Riga conference. Don't forget to tune in back tomorrow morning to watch the conference online, and also watch the following several coffee break sessions. Thank you very much.